Hi everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. So before we start this event, I wanted to hand it over to our next year's President Wayne Beckerman, but first I'm going to go through my spiel one last time that I know you all have heard a ton of times, but my name is Amanda Sauls and I'm this year's Texas Federalist Society President. The Federalist Society is a national network comprised of conservative and libertarian attorneys, judges, scholars, and students. And as a student chapter, the Texas Federalist Society strives to promote freedom, federalism, and the rule of law, and we do so through facilitating debate and discussion within the law school community. Today is our very last event of this year, so thank you all for coming. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to next year's President, Wayne Beckerman.
First off, I want to thank Amanda and all this past year's officers team for doing such an awesome job, putting on such great events, having the best speakers around. I really appreciate that, and it's going to make my job so much easier next year. I just want to briefly recognize our incoming officer team. First off, we have Alana Brolier, who will be VP of External Affairs. Then we have Ashley Burfeld, who will be VP of Internal Affairs. Christian Sweeney, who will be our Speakers Chair. David Kalinda, who will be our Development Chair. We have Ted Hochter and Elizabeth, oh my gosh. Elizabeth Butler, wow, I'm so sorry. Ted Hochter and Elizabeth Butler will be our...
It's all her comma professor's fault.
Both of them will be our Austin Lawyers Chapter Outreach Chair. They'll be specifically building a relationship with the Federalist Society attorneys here in town. Then we also have Maddie Stein, who will be our Operations Chair. We have Brittany Bratcher, who will be our Membership Chair. We have Brittany Justice, who will be our Publicity Chair. Marco Vasquez, our Finance Chair. Garrett McMillan, who will be our Policy Chair for next year. Paul Hill, who will be our Co-Symposium Chair, along with Amanda Sauls, who will be helping him in that role. And I think that is everything. But thank you so much. And Elizabeth, I'm sorry for forgetting your last name again. Yes, and now I'll hand it over to Alana to introduce today's speaker.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is with great pleasure that I introduce our three speakers today, each of which are leaders in their field and each of which we are lucky enough to have here at Texas Law. First, we have Steve Vladeck, who is a professor at Texas Law. His teaching and research focus on federal jurisdiction, constitutional law, national security law, and military justice. Professor Vladeck is a nationally recognized expert on the role of federal courts in the war on terrorism, and his writings have appeared in publications ranging from the Harvard and Yale Law Reviews to the New York Times and BuzzFeed. Vladeck is CNN's Supreme Court analyst, a co-author...
That's enough, then away.
All right. Professor Bobby Chesney is a professor and associate dean for the academic affairs at Texas Law. In addition, he is director of the Robert S. Strauss Center for International Security and Law, a university-wide research unit to improve understanding of international security issues.
That's funny.
It's on your website.
He's the more interesting one.
And he's got the lowest profile on the internet, too.
You do have the fewest Twitter followers. It's true. It's true.
Your pug,
You can help me.
Yeah.
That one.
Professor Vladeck, your pug has more Instagram followers than I do. Fun fact.
She has more Instagram followers than I do.
But anyway, so...
At Roxanna the Pug.
Together, Vladeck and Chesney have a national security law podcast, and together with Professor Tait here, they also run the Lawfare blog, which is a leading source for analysis, commentary, and news relating to law and national security. Matthew Tait is a cybersecurity fellow at the Robert S. Strauss Center as well, and he was previously CEO of Capital Alpha Security, a consultancy in the UK, worked at Google Project Zero, was a principal security consultant for SEC Partners and NGS Secure, and worked as an information security specialist for Britain's government communication headquarters. He has also been involved in the Mueller investigation into the Russian interference. First
line on the tombstone.
And he has a Bachelor of Engineering from Imperial College in London and is an adjunct professor here at Texas Law. Please help me in welcoming our speakers.
So, fair warning, we're about to record an episode of the Lawfare podcast. The Lawfare podcast reaches 30 to 40,000 listeners each week. Steve, you ready to go live?
Not live.
Or-
Wait, live? I missed that
In
part.
the radio booth sense.
In the radio booth sense. Yeah, we're good.
Okay, so welcome to not the National Security Law
Wait, you
Podcast.
have to start over. You said welcome with no like cue or anything else. Okay.
Hello from Austin, and welcome to not the National Security Law Podcast, but the Lawfare Podcast. This is Bobby Chesney at the University of Texas with my colleagues, Professors Steve Vladeck and Matt Tait. And we are here thanks to the invitation of the fabulous UT Austin chapter of the Federalist Society. They're in the room with us.
And there are thousands of them.
We had to go do this outside.
Well, it is not snowing here.
That's true. Hey, everything's open. So we're here to talk about Russia, computer network operations, cyber warfare, and other exciting things. And what we think we'll do is we'll start with Matt doing a scene setter, reviewing some of the technical and policy and other fascinating aspects of what happened recently in the electoral context and some of the ways in which hacking and espionage and information operations, covert action, and other things have all come together into a big complicated mess. Then we're going to turn it into a bit more of a dialogue and then try to bring all of you all in as much as possible so we can answer your questions. So without further ado, let's hear from Matt first. Matt, what the heck happened?
Wow, so where to start? I mean, this is a huge topic that I think is very easy to compress into sort of easy sound bites. It's very difficult to sort of prize things apart. Oh, Bobby's taking a selfie, so hey everybody. So when we look at a lot of the sort of election interference over the past couple of years, we can see a series of quite distinct operations from Russian security services, from various other organizations, many of which have very interesting policy and sort of cybersecurity, but also legal aspects, which I think we'll talk about today. So if we sort of wind the clock back to a little bit before the 2016 election, we can start to see a lot of computer hacking operations by Russian security services against large numbers of different people inside the United States. We have people like General Breedlove has his emails hacked. We see people like John Podesta has his emails hacked. We see people like junior White House staffers having their emails hacked. And this all starts to get published in some various WordPress sites, various Twitter feeds start to appear, trying to discredit a lot of these individuals. And so this feels like a very interesting information operation, and lots of cybersecurity professionals start to get involved and start to say, well, what's going on here? Is this a nation state? Is this, individual sort of anonymous type hackers? And then what we start to see as we get to really about June the 14th, something very interesting happens, which is that the Washington Post publishes this really interesting article saying that the DNC itself has been hacked. And this is very interesting because a cybersecurity company called CrowdStrike has gone and had a look at the DNC's internal network, and they are reasonably confident that this is not just the Russian government, but two different groups aligned with the Russian government. There's one that they call Fancy Bear and one that they call Cozy Bear. And cybersecurity is this great industry where we have all of these ridiculous names. But Fancy Bear is this group that we're pretty confident is the Russian military intelligence, GRU. And there's this other group called Cozy Bear, where different people have different opinions as to whether this is the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, or whether it's the domestic, sort of vaguely domestic intelligence organization, the FSB. And they start to publish a lot of these documents in the next few weeks under the pseudonym Guccifer 2, or Guccifer 2.
And who was Guccifer 1?
So Guccifer 1 was...
Oh, wait, actually, so why isn't it Guccifer? Because it's inspired by Gucci, right? Or is Lucifer kind of blended to take over? Is that the deal?
So, this is one of those conversations like, is it GIF or GIF, right? I mean,
Well, the peanut butter, the peanut butter is GIF.
Right. So the original Guccifer was, I forget his name now, Lazar something, was a Romanian hacker who hacked Sid Blumenthal, I believe, who is, for those of you that don't know him, he was an advisor to Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State. He hacked Sid Blumenthal's emails and published a lot of them online. He was eventually arrested by, I think, the Secret Service. and taken to the US. His handle was Guccifier. The reason for this was that it was the combination of the word Gucci, as in the brand, because he was fabulous, and Lucifer, because he was evil. and so that's where the name came from. This second hacker group, they call themselves Guccifier 2 or Guccifer 2, referencing this in order to say, hey, I'm this independent hacker, I'm not the Russian government. CrowdStrike might say, I'm the Russian government, but they're wrong, F them, right? You know, I'm an individually aligned hacker, I'm just this second incarnation of him, right? And it's clearly not the same guy, because the same guy is currently in jail. So, lots of cybersecurity professionals, you know, when CrowdStrike first came out and said, hey, this is the Russian government, they said, well, CrowdStrike's not published any information about this. And it's very easy, I think, to say, this is, you know, a government, this is, you know, my client has been hacked by the world's best hackers. It's not because they suck at cybersecurity, it's because the world's best hackers went after them. Not just one of the world's best hackers, 2 different government departments who are both, you know, world-class hackers. So there's a lot of debate initially as to whether this was true. But when they started publishing the document, suddenly there was all this new information that was out there. There was the documents themselves, which allow you to sort of prize through the metadata and say, well, you know, some of these documents have been doctored, and we can see things like the usernames of who's doctored them, and we can see that those users are, you know, Russian. We can see that it's been edited using Russian versions of Microsoft Word. We can start to see where inside various networks this has been. We can see what some of the edits are. You know, for instance, there was a document where they had taken a national security document from, I think it was 2006 or something, and they had added the word secret to the top of it, right? So for those of you that know US national security, lots of documents have the word secret at the top of it, demonstrating that they're classified, so this would be a big deal in the event that they had managed to hack classified documents from the DNC. That would say something very bad, and if you remember at the time there was lots of concern over Hillary Clinton's storage of potentially classified information on her emails, that would be politically toxic. And so it was very interesting that they were doing some of these edits. And so lots of cybersecurity professionals started pulling this apart and saying, well, people are doctoring these documents. This is really interesting. And it looks like this is the Russian government. And as this sort of started to come out, you start to see a reaction from these people that are distributing these documents. So we say, hey, there's a bunch of Russian usernames in some of these documents, and then they publish more documents. And in these new documents, they have usernames which are very carefully crafted to discredit the previous ones. So the previous one was in Russian, so the new ones are in Spanish, right? And then the next ones are in Chinese. So obviously this is an intentional edit. And then you start to see, really towards the middle of summer, this sort of mass dumping of emails, right, from the DNC and from John Podesta. And that's where this starts to sort of change quite dramatically into what cybersecurity professionals would call an information operation. This is no longer just espionage. This is no longer them just taking a couple of documents and trying to discredit an attribution. This is them converting documents into trying to affect public opinion. And so this has all sorts of really interesting consequences. And then if you start to plot out over the final few weeks of the election campaign, the final, I think, 4 weeks, every single day, WikiLeaks has new trash of John Podesta's emails, right? Every single day, right? So Sunday here's WikiLeaks, number 1, John Podesta's emails. Then Monday, the next one. Then Tuesday, the next one. Then Wednesday, the next one. And what happens is that every single day journalists have to go and look through these emails, and they say, well, today I found, John Podesta's risotto recipe, right? Tomorrow I found, oh, there was a question from a journalist that was emailed in advance. The next day, oh, something else has happened. And so every single day journalists are looking through this new set of emails, a couple of hundred emails each day. And they would write a story on what they've done, because that's what journalists do, right? Once you've done something, you write about what you did. And so what happened was this completely dominated all of the media stories, all of the headlines at the time. And what we now know is we know that the CIA and the NSA were very upset about this information operation, which they knew was from the Russian government. And on August the 4th, so at the beginning of summer, they set up a task group internally to try and combat this. And we know that John Brennan, who was the director of the CIA at the time, phoned his Russian counterpart saying, hey, we see what you're doing, please kindly stop. And clearly that didn't work out very well. But one of the things that we do know is we know that there was internal debates as to what the US response should be. We know that there was internal debates inside the Russian government as to what their response should be. We know, for instance, that on the very final few days before the election, that President Obama phoned up his counterpart, Vladimir Putin, on the nuclear hotline phone and said, I see what you're doing. If you interfere with this election, right, it's game over for you guys. Right? And we can see that, for instance, on the very, very final day of the election, there was this enormous Twitter campaign of these bots run by the Internet Research Agency and other groups, which was planning to discredit the election. Right? Everybody thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win. Right? The day before, if you remember, I think the Washington Post said there's a 98% chance that Hillary Clinton is going to win this election. Right? So, great prediction, guys. But everybody, including the Russian government, believed that Hillary Clinton was going to win. And on the very final day, there was this enormous push to discredit the election with hashtag democracy RIP. And this sort of ramps up on the very final day until Florida declares. And then this entire bot network just vanishes. Like in a second, it just goes completely silent. And it's fascinating to sort of see this. You can sort of see some of the sort of artifacts for this. And then, you know, the Goosefire 2 WordPress blog basically goes silent, right? The DC Leaks distributors vanish. Shadow Brokers evaporates and briefly comes back in January when there's talk about the NSA responding, right? So we can really start to see some of these different aspects of this information operation, some of the different strands of this operation, in effect, happening during the 2016 election.
So let's categorize this set of events you've just described separately from a legal perspective and a policy perspective. Steve, maybe starting with you. Legally, what's the right thing to say about all of that? And bearing in mind that it seems like the typical headline when people write about this in the media all too often says, you know, cyber attack, cyber war. Legally speaking, should we be talking about attack and war?
Oh, man. Can I go third? So let's start at the beginning. I mean, I think what Matt has described, and I think we should all be clear on this, is a series of fairly substantial federal crimes. Right? I mean, there are any number of federal statutes, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act just being the tip of the iceberg, that prohibit the kind of sort of hacking activity Matt describes, right? Stealing people's emails, republishing them without permission. I mean, so there's very little question that almost all of the sort of, you know, operative parts of the story were certainly at least violations of U.S. criminal law.
Can I jump in there and ask, are the media outlets that carried forward these stories and republished these documents, are they in any way culpable?
Probably not. I mean, so there's you know, a line of First Amendment jurisprudence that protects the right of the media, at least when they are not directly responsible for the commission of the underlying crime. So there's a 2000 Supreme Court case called Bartnicki versus Vopper, where a 6-3 court was okay with a Florida radio station broadcasting on air a conversation that had been recorded in violation of Florida law. Because the radio station had not themselves been part of the unlawful recording, it came over the transom to them. They weren't actually soliciting the violation. So I don't think there's, you know, for like the New York Times, no, for WikiLeaks, you know, messier.
Right, and so for those who don't follow this, as some of you may know, the Justice Department under both Obama and now under Trump, there's been sort of long-running rumblings about whether at some point federal prosecutors should indict or pursue an indictment Julian Assange.
Or have indicted.
Or perhaps have, and it's sealed. Or WikiLeaks. And one of the questions there is you've never had, if you categorize WikiLeaks as the same thing as New York Times, there's never been a case like that. And for a host of both policy and political reasons and for possible First Amendment reasons.
And even if you classify WikiLeaks just as a downstream recipient of classified information, wholly apart from the media piece of it, there's only been one attempted prosecution
With the Rosen case?
Yeah, the Rosen case from 2005, under the Espionage Act for a downstream recipient of classified information, and that case fell apart. So it would be an uphill battle.
Yeah, I think that if there is an indictment already, if there's got to be maybe something more akin, if they could prove it, to conspiracy to violate computer fraud and abuse.
I think that's right, because that's just less sort of fraught with all that baggage.
Yeah.
The messier question, and I want to sort of come at the messier question from the backside, if I may. You see the word treason bandied about a whole lot these days. And I've been like a one-man band on the whole, like, let's please stop calling it treason. Right, that people look at sort of some of the most severe allegations against either the president or those close to him, or at the very least those who may have facilitated some of this hacking, and say, well, gosh, that sure looks like treason to me. And my response is, well, fortunately, I'm the law professor and you're not. Right? Treason, right, both constitutionally and as a matter of statute, is when someone who owes allegiance to the United States levies war against the United States or provides aid and comfort to our enemies. Now, enemy in this context is an important word. Enemy does not just mean adversary, right? Enemy doesn't mean whoever we don't like today. Enemy means country with which we are at war. And at least during World War II, that led to these awkward, but I think correct rulings in a series of district court cases where these Nazis, or at least these Nazi sympathizing Americans, who were prosecuted for treason based on stuff that happened before December 8th, 1941, were let off the hook, right? Because before December 8th, we were not at war with Nazi Germany, therefore they couldn't have committed treason, even if some other bad stuff. So I start here because I think the impulse that leads people to call this treason is an impulse that what Matt has described are acts of war, right? That hostile, offensive cyber penetration for the purpose of affecting the domestic public policy and perhaps even elections of a sovereign country may in fact, at least in some people's perspective, get us pretty close to the threshold of active war, of armed conflict, of the kind of sort of setup that would let us call it treason. I'm a little skeptical, right? And the reason why I'm skeptical, as you may have noticed, is because under at least the sort of long-standing international law norms, right, the threshold is usually some kind of armed attack, right, that produces some kind of kinetic reaction. And so I think, for example, you might contrast the interference with the United States, electoral processes, with popular discourse, with the, I think, increasingly unsecret U.S.-Israeli operation to sabotage the Iranian nuclear reactor. Right, which actually did, by all accounts, produce a kinetic effect, right? We destroyed the centrifuges, we destroyed the computers, where we hijacked the computers and they destroyed the centrifuges.
Yeah, so this is the Stuxnet operation.
Stuxnet, right. That to me is closer, right? Because there you have a cyber operation that is producing some kind of kinetic effect. I may be sort of an outlier here, but at least from where I sit, like from my perspective, cyber attacks by one country against another are grave, they're serious, they raise all kinds of very, very difficult, public international law questions. I just worry about sort of jumping into the war mantra when we don't have many of the sort of traditional hallmarks of armed conflict, where we don't have kinetic ramifications, where we don't have the destruction of property and or people. That's where I sort of, I just don't think we're there yet. But this is why cyber is interesting, because it might be, much harder to draw that line, even when we know who the perpetrator is.
So this is a recurring theme. For those of us who work in this space, one of the recurring and frankly kind of stale debates over the past 5, 10, even longer number of years is what counts as war in cyberspace? What counts as an armed attack? What is cyber war? And as Steve says, there are a range of ways you could try to answer that. One possibility is to have an effects-based test, and that's a very commonly cited view. And what you look for is an effect in the real physical world. The real world's the wrong way to talk about it. The physical world to be akin to what you'd categorize as warfare in the traditional sense. Others have said, that makes sense for most cases, but if that's not just a sufficient condition, but also a necessary condition, then what would you say if another state or anybody managed to take down all the data in our banking system in one fell swoop and causes an effect that over time would be orders of magnitude worse than any one single missile would be? And isn't there some sorts of digital-only harms that would have ramifications that actually eventually could turn into physical ramifications because of the downstream effects of economic disruption? Couldn't that at some point become war? And if at least the extreme hypothetical makes you think, yeah, if you could actually delete all the records of our banking system and pitch the United States, and by the way, the world, into depression as a result of doing that, that's an act of war. What else might count? And then you turn to this interesting question of election manipulation. At a certain point, isn't the sanctity of the election process the sort of thing that cuts close enough to the bone of national interest and sovereignty to where you might, maybe not in this case, but in other cases, might be willing to treat it as a cause for war? What do you guys think? Could election manipulation standing alone ever cross that line? Or is it, however big a deal it is, not a fit subject for talking about it in terms of military response and warfare?
I just let me put it this way. I mean, so imagine if, let me sort of try to frame the hypothetical in pre-digital terms, right? Imagine if the U.S., used covert operations to manipulate the results of an election in a different country, right?
Don't necessarily have to imagine.
Well, it's a real fantastical hypothetical.
Well, let's give a concrete example of 1948, Middle East post-World War II election. The KGB, the Soviet Union is trying very hard to push through a communist government, and thank God we pushed really hard to prevent that.
Right. So I guess all I'm trying to say is I think that there is a meaningful distinction to be had, even if we have line drawing problems, between gross violations of international sovereignty, which are, I think, serious things that we ought to think about what the proper remedial framework is for, and armed attacks that actually ought to and do call into play all of the conventional understandings of the law of armed conflict, the right of countries to act in self-defense, etc. So, that's not to say, no, cyber attacks are fine, right? It's to say we ought to keep separate things separate, at least from my perspective, until the cyber attacks are actually producing not just a political effect, but a kinetic effect. I think it's safer, right, to sort of keep the conversation separate.
Matt, why so much resort, at least in the media, and I think in more general public discussion of these things, why the constant reference to cyber warfare and it's an attack? Why the martial language?
So I think there's a lot of people that are very upset with the events that happened. I think using strong language is
2018.
Yes, this is one of the ways that people try and resolve this. People like to use the word treason because it makes it sound like a bigger deal, right?
It's a bigger deal than just hijacking the election and interfering with foreign policy.
Yes, which is just a trivial thing.
Right.
Yeah. We see this is a constant problem actually in cybersecurity and the way that it's discussed in the press. We have the word cyber attack is used for really quite trivial things. And of course, as lawyers know, the word attack has meanings. Like words have meanings. Treason is not a word that we get to define colloquially in this country. It is sort of clearly defined in the Constitution. Right? It's quite difficult to change its meaning.
That's just textualism.
Boo, right?
Not in this room.
So, one of the difficulties I think with cybersecurity in particular, though, is that it's quite difficult sometimes at the larger end of the scale to see where the lines are between when you're doing an attack that is very big and we clearly object to, and where that actually tips over into actually having meaningful effects in, say, a law of armed conflict sense. So to give you a good example, I think it was last year. I've lost all sense of time over the past year. So it was either last year or the year before. There was an attack called NotPetya, which was an attack which has now been publicly attributed by the US government and a number of other governments as being Russia pushed an update, a security update to Ukrainian software, Ukrainian accounting software, which installed ransomware on those devices, right? And so everybody that had to file taxes in Ukraine, which is a lot of Ukrainian companies, but also a lot of international companies, ended up with ransomware destroying very large numbers of computers. And this disrupted operations for FedEx, for UPS, it disrupted...
The shipping line Maersk suffered billions.
Yeah, we've seen even companies like Boeing suffered. Oreo production was globally disrupted. Condom production was globally disrupted. This is sort of really quite significant damage, like Ukrainian government offices were shuttered. So when you start to see sort of, this was a destruction of information rather than, you know, a kinetic attack, but you can start to see that, you know, and this was geographically centered on Ukraine. But let's suppose that a similar attack had been geographically centered on the United States, like, you know, that they had destroyed, you know, large numbers of companies, you know, in the financial sector, or, you know, disrupted the electrical grid by destroying information but not technically causing kinetic effects. You can start to see that those we might start to think of in these more sort of strong terms, in the sort of sense that that's an attack.
So I know what we do in that situation. We get on the phone, we call our Russian counterparts and say, stop it. Problem solved.
That works with my 2-year-old.
Does it? No, I didn't think so. Okay, so in all seriousness, so obviously calling them up and saying knock it off doesn't help. What would help?
Well, I think this is why you're seeing so much discussion of sort of economic sanction regimes, right? That one of the ways that the international system basically coerces bad acting states into stop acting badly is through various forms of economic pressure, whether on the government itself or on private interests within that country and so on. You know, I think this is why one of the few pieces of legislation this Congress has passed over the president's objections, although ultimately not over his veto, has been the Russia sanctions legislation. Because I think there's an understanding that, you know, although I think we can debate the efficacy and the adequacy of sanctions, they are a very common and, you know, at least to some degree, important first step toward the punitive response, right? Toward the sort of, you know, you are going to reap consequences for this short of, you know, us bombing you.
You know, the Russian sanctions bill is fascinating because it's got a number of different parts in it. One part's kind of keyed more towards punishment for Russian military aggression in Ukraine, but one part of it is focused on Russian computer network operations. And for a while there was some complexity as to exactly how hard it tried to lever the executive branch into actually then using the authority to sanction that it granted. But it did put some pressure on the administration, and it had some deadlines involved. And for a long while there, it looked as if the Trump administration wasn't acting under that authority. And of course, that went with the narrative, the larger narrative that the Trump administration is soft on Russia. More recently, the Treasury Department, which is the executive agent for this sanctions regime, did come out and I would describe pretty aggressively articulating the grounds for sanctions and naming a bunch of entities and individuals to sanction them. It didn't get a lot of attention in part because it's in the weeds and in part because it does run a little bit counter to the narrative of the administration being soft on Russia. But there are
oh, come on, that's
you don't think it runs? You don't think it?
I think
it was consistent?
I think part of why it didn't get a lot of attention is because, yes, that's what Treasury did, and then shortly thereafter the president congratulated President Putin on his re-election.
That came much later, and when Treasury did this, there was a really strong statement that you would expect from any administration denouncing the Russians for attempting to assassinate the defector and his daughter in the UK, saying all the things you would want it to say. There have been interesting questions about whether there's going to be more sanctions. Treasury Secretary Mnuchin said there would be more, but I'm trying to give credit where credit's due. They did actually act on this.
No, I'm not disagreeing that the Treasury Department deserves credit. I'm just suggesting that it could be a little hard on the media for, you know.
Oh, I wouldn't criticize the media. As I said, it's down in the weeds too. It's just not the sort of thing you're going to see a lot of attention.
And you would have heard all about it on the National Security Law podcast.
You certainly would. At NSL Podcast on Twitter. So. We've been trying to just sort of set the table for the benefit of the students who I hope will now be ready to jump in with some questions. We're three professors. We'll just keep talking nonstop. Even after you've all left and the lights are off, we'll be in here for months to come. There's a question in the back. You say it and then we'll repeat it to make sure that the listeners on the podcast can hear it.
So you just talked about using economic sanctions as a way to compel compliance with not doing a bad thing. I think historically, there seems to be a mixed bag of arguments as to whether that's effective. Many point to usage in Iran and North Korea as not being as effective, and others would see it as such as implementation with apartheid in South Africa, more as a positive example. Let's say that they're not very effective. Pre-World War I, we really had the ability to fight a limited war of policy along with what von Clausewitz would have described as good war policy by other means. And post that, it seems like we've really only been able to have total war. So with the assumption that economic sanctions don't work, is there a capacity where we could fight a limited war in the 21st century, or is that completely gone after World War I and II?
In circumstances in which...
Do you want to repeat the question first?
Oh yeah, right, sorry. I was the one that said we were going to do that. The question boils down to the proposition that when it comes to great power warfare in particular, your options, if there's going to be any kind of overt armed conflict, it's very hard to prevent the spiral into total warfare, right? And in a way, our increasing military might writ large as humanity and as governments means that the ability to have smaller scale, or what used to be called imperfect war, limited war, or quasi-war, it's not really in the tool set anymore because of the way it could spiral out. So what is there in that space between sanctions and diplomacy, or even indictments, and going to full-scale war? Because if there's nothing in that space, if it's a barbell in the tool set with a really empty spot in the area where you might have a little sharper leverage, that just tightens the hand, or makes it much tougher for policymakers. I would say that in the modern era, what's in that space is covert action. And that we need to distinguish in our minds, and I'll put in a plug here for next spring's Law of the Intelligence Community course I'm teaching. Espionage, that's the capture of information or the collection of information. Covert action is defined from the US perspective at least as activity to affect events outside the United States where the sponsoring or controlling role of the United States is not meant to be acknowledged or apparent. And the way that from the Cold War throughout into the present day, the way that states have basically screwed with each other, at least at the level of the United States and the Russians, is through covert action. And I would describe the Russian election interference as cyber-enabled and espionage-enabled covert action by the Russians, a particular kind. Covert action can run the full spectrum from relatively innocuous, minor, small interferences with events abroad to very dramatic and indeed kinetic interference with events abroad. And so the difference isn't so much, the label isn't so much about what you're doing, but it's about reducing the pressure on the other side to have to respond by escalating to the next level. They could choose to, but as Iran chose not to immediately and directly respond to the Stuxnet covert action operation by declaring that there was a war between the United States, but rather they kind of kept it at the same level, and eventually they engaged in some computer network activity of their own. I think that's what's going on instead of the sort of the 19th century sort of wars of minor aggression, if you will.
I would just add, I think the other question is, how much do you trust either our administration or the Russian government to the cooler heads therein to prevail? So, I think you have something of a bit of a proxy war right now in Syria and Ukraine, where I think there are at least, opportunities for US-backed, if not US-flagged forces to run into Russian-backed, if not Russian-flagged forces in active combat. But if you've noticed, when that's happened, both governments have been very quick to say, no, that's not really what happened. Right, so in Syria, right, we killed a whole bunch of Russians, and they're like, no, those are just military contractors. It was cool. I think there's a reason for that, right? Which I think that there's a real concern that the potential for escalation between, two well-stocked nuclear powers calls the Clausewitzian model into at least some question, at least in this context. And then the question becomes, is there a more aggressive way to put teeth into the sanctions regime? Could you see more hostile moves toward diplomats in both countries? So, the president announced that we were expelling 60 Russian diplomats and closing the Seattle consulate, and then we found out shortly afterward, but they can send another 60, right? Just these 60. Presumably there are more aggressive moves you can make on the diplomatic front long before you get to actually shooting at each other.
Matt, you have a view about, you have a pretty strong view about the utility of actually doing the expelling of diplomats, and you've persuaded me that it's more meaningful than I originally thought.
So yeah, this is not in response to the 2016 election. This is in response to the Skripal attempted assassination, which ended up with a very large number of UK citizens collaterally exposed to nerve agents, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, the UK authorities were extremely unhappy with. And so the UK authorities, I think, actually have done sort of a masterclass in what diplomatic sanctions short of war actually look like. when you're really genuinely very upset about actions internationally. So the UK expelled 23 diplomats. They were able to persuade very large numbers of allies to also expel diplomats. These are diplomats very much in the air quote sense. The UK has publicly said that the people that they exposed were undeclared Russian intelligence officers. The US has made a similar claim. They ended up with an ambassador expelled from Lithuania. There's about 150 Russians expelled globally. This is the first round of expulsions. There's quite likely there's going to be a second round as well. When you think about an intelligence operation globally, 150 undeclared intelligence officers have just been sent home to Russia, right? Yes, they're going to be able to replace them, but that's going to take a lot of time. That's, a lot of experience, a lot of people who have, agents that they've built relationships up with globally across, all of these number of capitals. That's going to take a long time. That's going to be really painful for the Russian intelligence services to correct. They're going to have to train a whole bunch more people because, sure they were undeclared before, but now everybody knows who they are. So, it's not like you can just send them to other, countries.
Put them in disguise.
So, yes, they can send another 60, but these are another 60 that don't have the relationships in the US. They don't have the consulate.
Oh no, I agree. My point is that I think there's a sliding scale of aggressive diplomatic and foreign relations reactions, and we're actually still at like 2 on the scale of 1 to 10 of just how aggressive we can get with regard to expelling people and putting pressure on Russians in the United States.
So one of the difficulties, of course, is if you look at something like North Korea, I think that's a good example where we're at maximum volume all the time.
Yeah.
And a consequence of us being at maximum volume all the time is we actually have very little delta additional pressure that we can put on them when we get upset. We don't have an embassy there. We don't have any more sanctions that can really.
And so in turn, we rely on those countries that still aren't at 10, like China,
which is only at 9.5.
Right, and we say, hey, can we get you to 9.6?
Yeah.
Right. No, listen.
I say we don't share your national interests. We have our national interests.
Listen, I don't want anyone to hear me as saying that I think sanctions are the be-all, end-all. My point is just that I think that there are degrees of aggression that we have not yet experimented with in the Russia case.
Correct.
That I at least would be in favor of pursuing before we start firing stuff at them.
Boycotting the World Cup, maybe.
Well, that's not going to be a problem for the Americans.
Exactly. As I said in class yesterday,
we're not going.
We preemptively boycotted this. The U.S. men's team knew. They knew.
Panama helped us out there. They did us a solid.
The deep state.
That's right. The deep state beat the U.S. soccer team.
Question in the back.
So, Professor Chesney, in the introduction, you referred to this line between what is acts of war and what is not acts of war. My question is, based on what we've observed over the last year or several years, are there things on the non-war side of that bright line that is not being done by adversaries like Russia right now that could be being done that you particularly worry about spilling over onto the second side of that line?
Well, there's a good example, and so the question is, we have a certain number of things that we've talked about already that Russia and other adversaries have done that we're saying, as bad as they are, maybe they're not rising to the level of war. Are there some things that either we've not talked about or that might occur that would begin to make that a tougher call or would make us start to worry about slipping over into that line? Now, when the organizers of the event reached out to us, one of the things they mentioned we ought to talk about, which we haven't yet mentioned, is the implants that Russia at least has on some aspects of, was it the grid, Matt, or was it the oil and gas industry's various pipelines? There were some stories about this.
So one of the things that happens between sort of so many of the great states is sort of hacking operations directed at each other's grids in order to prepare in event that they need to disrupt each other's power operations. And it's now public that the Russian security services have been doing that against the US, they've been doing that in Europe. We know that Iran does it to Saudi Arabia, we know that Saudi Arabia does it to Iran. It is pretty likely that the US is doing this to lots of other countries. Admiral Rogers, who's both the director of the NSA but also the commander of Cybercom, was asked in Congress just a couple of weeks ago whether or not he was preparing for battle in his capacity as director of Cyber Command, and he refused to get drawn as to what exactly that meant in an unclassified setting, but sort of reading between the lines, the US is definitely hacking Russia's grids just in case.
Semper Fi.
So what's tricky about this, of course, is that in some contexts, we talk about intrusion into a network. You find some vulnerability, you get into a network, you establish your position there, and you move around laterally in the network, and you're in a great position to gather information, so it's an espionage tool, perhaps. But the same access that provides you the ability to take data from the other entity could be the access you might need as well, not just to steal data or copy data, but to delete or alter data, or take steps to actually cause some physical system to shut down. One of the energy infrastructure systems, I forget where this was, Matt, you may know the details. There was a intrusion into one of the safety systems, if I recall correctly, on an industrial control system, and I think this was attributed to the Russians. Now that's not something you break into because you're going to possibly collect some information. That is there so that you will have the ability to cause a physical effect at some point. That doesn't mean, though, that you're going to, and as Matt said, you shouldn't assume that we aren't doing the same things. Everyone who's potentially going to be in a great power conflict, who can imagine things getting, as was said earlier, to the stage of total warfare, is beginning to think about, well, in that eventuality, where will I wish I had access? And related to that, especially for, if you're the Russians, you might think, I'd like the Americans to notice that we can do this. And we'll let them, or they may notice, or on accident they may discover us, or we may purposely let them see that we've accessed this particular system. Lo and behold, look at that capability we've got. You can wonder where else we've got that capability. You may know, you may not know. So these are ways of both signaling in sort of a saber rattling sort of way at one another. It's sort of the digital equivalent, you might say, to having the 7th Fleet, conduct a carrier task force goes through some particular area. But it's also simply preparation of the battlefield in the perhaps unlikely eventuality, but nonetheless the eventuality that there may be armed conflict later. Now, of course, this hopefully raises in your mind, a bunch of law students here, you're thinking, well, wait a minute, the grid, I mean, that's a lot of civilian infrastructure, and if we're talking about war, you get into lots of complexities with respect to what counts as a civilian object. What normally civilian objects, like the grid, may also be dual military use, and therefore in the event of armed conflict might nonetheless become targetable. The grid, I think, depends on which country and which setup you're talking about, whether or not it's a particular electrical an energy distribution system where the military really does depend in some sense on that. The American military in many ways, but not every way, does depend to some extent on the public electric grids in the various parts of the country. And you can say the same thing about a lot of communication systems as well. So it's a bit of a scary world when you start contemplating that, because the whole point of that discussion is to imagine what would it be like if there was a war. We've been talking about the Russians, we haven't talked about the Chinese. That's a big part of this story as well.
This is really uplifting.
Well, but let me point out, there is, I don't know if we ate all the ice cream, there was ice cream here, didn't there?
Well, what's the, go to Arby's because you just never know? Isn't that
But nihilist Arby's.
yeah, nihilist Arby's.
We've got about 5 minutes left, so we can take one more question or go down the China path.
Yes.
So is this, what's been going on, or what was happening with the election? I mean, the US, we know, has been trying to interfere in other countries' elections for many years. Like, this is not something new. So is this just so much worse because now they're messing with us? Or is it just because they're so much more effective at it because of, because they have these huge platforms, like social media platforms, to distribute information? And then what do we do about, like, what can we do about that? What's the remedy? Besides, I mean, I know we talked about sanctions a little bit, but.
So I'm going to take one shot on is this worse? So from a sort of global perspective, no. I mean, I think the U.S. engineering coups, right, in various countries is, not any better, right, than what the Russians did or may have done, right, using 2016. From my perspective, and I realize this might be an unpopular viewpoint, What makes this worse, other than that it's us and it's now, is that we have a sort of government, the leader of which is affirmatively committed to denying that this happened. And whatever you think of the president, and reasonable people can disagree about him, I find it so alarming that the president refuses to accept what most of the government accepts, what both intelligence committees accept, what I think the average, halfway intelligent person accepts, which is that the Russians did try to interfere and probably interfered, if not in the actual count of votes, then certainly in public discourse around the election. And so I think what makes it worse from my perspective and scary from my perspective is, how do we have any faith that the government is taking seriously the need to ensure better protection against these kinds of attacks, right? Better security measures, better ways of preventing this from happening again, if you have a president who refuses to accept publicly that this happened in the first place?
I think that's right. I think that really the difficulty is not so much the policy debate as to what we should do in response. I think reasonable people will disagree as to whether we should have a stronger or a weaker or a different category of response. I think the difficulty is when you end up with an assault on sort of the premise that this actually took place at all. Part of the point of information operations is that they exist in sort of this grey zone where they can deny that this took place. And I think what we're having at the moment is this sort of question as to how far up to that line can you get where the US administration is unwilling to call it out. How thin a veneer of deniability can you still operate in and get away with that? I think that that's particularly difficult in the current administration, where you really don't have the sort of the executive branch operating in a unitary fashion, where you do have these big events like the expulsion of 60 diplomats, but then also the president not talking about it, which really confuses, I think, international allies. It confuses the internal political discourse in this country. I do think that makes life much more difficult.
Yeah, so I don't disagree with any of that. I think that this question of how we defend our electoral systems is greatly complicated by our system of federalism, in which elections are administered, by and large at the state and local level, and state and local governments vary widely, to put it mildly, in the extent to which they're capable and focused on this issue and able to do anything about it. It's pretty clear we really haven't gotten our act together for reasons related to what Steve was saying about the politicization of the larger narratives around the legitimacy of the election and what the Russian role may have been. It's made it very hard to form a more traditional national consensus that whatever else is true, let's just make darn sure it's very hard to interfere with the actual voting process. And so we can expect further challenges of this variety. And I think we'd be well served if we had a massive and expensive effort just to make sure there's paper ballot backup for every single polling station in the country when it comes to the next round of national elections, but I don't see us doing it. And so, on that happy note, do we have time?
Yeah, we're out of time. Help me in thanking our speakers, please.